Hey guys, welcome back. We are continuing along with our book, The Deficit Myth by Dr. Stephanie Kelton. I hope you guys enjoyed the last one and learned a thing or two. I'm hoping you guys do enjoy this read and are able to come back maybe knowing things you didn't know or maybe just reinforcing some stuff you did know already. Other than that, let's get back into it. So, it's starting to make sense to me, at least in theory. I began to think of the government as a currency monopolist. Mozart's argument brought back childhood memories. In this case, playing the board game Monopoly with my family when I was just a kid. As I thought about the rules of the game, I began to see the parallels even more clearly. For one thing, the game can't begin until someone is put in control of the currency. The players don't pony up the money to get the game underway. They can't because they don't have it yet. The currency has to be issued before anyone can get it. After the initial dispensation, the players move around the board, buying property, paying rent, and landing in jail, or drawing a card that instructs them to pay $50 to the IRS. Each time I play, each time a player rounds the board, they receive a $200 payment from the person who controls the currency. Because the players are merely users of the currency, they can and do go broke. The issue, however, can never run out of money. In fact, the official rules of the game literally read, "The banker never goes broke." If the bank runs out of money, the banker may issue as much more money as may be needed by writing on an any ordinary paper, emphasis mine. I thought about this idea of writing on paper to make money when I took my own kids on a tour of the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing in Washington, D.C. If you haven't done it, I highly recommend it. It's eye-opening. You can schedule a tour on the government's own website, www.moneyfactory.gov. It's a far more sophisticated operation than making monopoly money by, quote, writing on any ordinary paper. But it amounts to too much the same thing. It's one of the places where the issuer of our currency manufactures it. One of the first things I noticed was an enormous neon sign suspended high above the engraving equipment. The sign read, in quote, "We make money the old-fashioned way. We print it." Everyone wanted to take a picture of it, but photos aren't permitted on the tour. The crowd marveled at the sign as reams of uncut $10, $20, and $100 spun from the machines. Then someone said, what we were all thinking, quote, "I wish I could do that." Alas, to avoid the orange jumpsuits, we need to leave the manufacturing to the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing. Those notes make up part of the supply of U.S. currency, as those old mason jars full of pennies, nickels, and dimes on your grandmother's shelf attest. The government also issues U.S. currency in the form of coins, just as the Federal Reserve describes itself as, quote, "the issuing authority for all Federal Reserve notes." The U.S. Mint describes itself as, quote, "the nation's sole manufacturer of legal tender coinage." Finally, the Federal Reserve issues digital dollars known as bank reserves. These are created exclusively via keystrokes on a computer controlled by the government's fiscal agent, the Federal Reserve. When the Wall Street banks needed trillions of dollars to survive the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed effortlessly conjured them into existence using nothing more than a keyboard at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. So what she's basically saying is that, well, number one, don't counterfeit coins, don't counterfeit money, don't try to use it as real currency when it's not. Don't do things like that. But also, she brought up the point I mentioned in the introduction video was all the Federal Reserve does, and things like it, is they take one decimal point, move it over, do a couple key punches, and next thing you know, there's a bunch of money that is printed out of nowhere. And that's what she's referring to. So, to the average person, it might seem as though the government literally takes the bills rolling off its printing press or coins, tumbling from its minting machines to pay its bills. Cable news shows certainly love the imagery of the mass production of money. They'll often air a story about government spending while running a video of newly manufactured dollars spewing from the printing press. but Federal Reserve notes and coins are mostly there for our convenience. It would be way too clunky for the federal government to pay Boeing for a fleet of new fighter jets with an enormous stockpile of physical currency. That's just not how it works. Olden days, yes. Nowadays, like she mentioned, was the virtual currency. As you know, when you go to the bank and you swipe your debit card or credit card, that's virtual currency. Or with Apple Pay or Cash App, it's the same thing. It's all online currency. So instead of having to take cash with you a lot now, you can just do it right then and there. So instead of handing over fistfuls of cash as a monopoly, the federal government makes most of its payments the way a scorekeeper assigns points in a game of bridge. Except instead of writing the points on a scorecard, payments simply get typed into a keyboard by someone at the Federal Reserve. Let me explain. Take military spending. In 2019, the House and Senate passed legislation that increased the military budget, approving $716 billion, nearly $80 billion more than Congress had authorized in fiscal year 2018. There was no debate about how to pay for the spending. No one asked, where would we get the extra $80 billion? Lawmakers didn't raise taxes or go out and borrow an extra $80 billion from savers so that the government could afford to make the additional payments. Instead, Congress committed to spending money it did not have. It can do that because of its special powers over the US dollar. Once Congress authorizes the spending, agencies like the Department of Defense are given permission to enter into contracts with companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and so on, to provision itself with F-35 fighters. The U.S. Treasury instructs the banks, the Federal Reserve, to carry out the payment on its behalf. This is done by marking up the numbers in Lockheed's bank account. Congress doesn't need to. Quote, find the money to spend it, and needs to find the votes. Once it has the votes, it can authorize the spending. The rest is just accounting. As the checks go out, the Federal Reserve clears the payments by crediting the sellers' accounts with the appropriate number of digital dollars, known as bank reserves. That's why MMT sometimes describes the Federal Reserve as the scorekeeper for the dollar. The scorekeeper can't run out of points. Think about where the points come from when you play a card game or go to a basketball game. They don't come from anywhere. They're just conjured into existence by the person doing the record keeping. When a basketball player drains a shot from behind the 3-point line, 3 points are added to the team's total. Does that scorekeeper reach into a bucket to get those 3 points? Of course not. The scorekeeper doesn't actually have any points to record a 3-point shot. The scorekeeper simply changes the number up and down. The bigger number lights up on the scoreboard. Now, suppose the play gets reviewed and the referees determine that the shot clock had run out. The points are taken away. But note that the arena doesn't actually collect anything. It's just adding and subtracting points. The same way the federal government adds and subtracts dollars from the economy when it spends and taxes. Uncle Sam doesn't lose any dollars when he spends and doesn't get any dollars when he taxes. That's why former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke refuted the claim that taxpayer dollars were being used to rescue banks after the financial crisis. Quote, the banks have accounts with the Fed. He explained, quote, we just used a computer to mark up the size of the accounts. Taxpayers didn't bail out Wall Street. The scorekeeper did. Bernanke's comments might remind some of you of the popular television show Whose Line Is This Anyways? The host, Drew Carey, introduced every episode by saying, quote, a show where everything's made up and the points don't matter. Now, he doesn't host the show anymore. I recommend you guys check out Whose Line Is It Anyway. It's really fucking funny. It was improv comedy, so everything really was made up. Throughout the show, Carey awarded imaginary points based on how thoroughly he and the audience were amused by the other comedians. No one should do anything with the points, so they really didn't matter. The government's points, however, do matter. For one thing, you and I need dollars to pay our taxes. And because taxes and death are an inescapable fact of life, the government's currency occupies a central place in our economic lives. Once a tax backed currency like the US dollar is introduced, it usually becomes the standard unit which everything else is priced. Walk into any restaurant or shopping mall in the United States, and you'll find a seller who's trying to earn dollars. Enter a courthouse, and you'll find a judge awarding damages in US dollars. Log onto your computer to order a pizza. You'll be expected to pay in dollars. We need the dollars. We need them from the only place they can come from, the currency issuer. The pizza parlor and the department store need them too, because ultimately they'll have to pay taxes as well. Even state and local governments rely on them because they have to pay the teachers, judges, firefighters, and police officers, all of whom expect to be paid in dollars. Only the scorekeeper is different. Uncle Sam doesn't need dollars. When he collects taxes from us, he's just subtracting away from some of our dollars. He doesn't actually get any dollars. It's jarring, I know. This is our first Copernican moment. It's why one journalist at the Financial Times described MMT as an auto stereogram. You know, one of those two-dimensional images that doesn't look like much until you focus your gaze a certain way and then the image behind the image comes into view, revealing an intricate 3D visual of a painted desert or a great white shark. Once you're able to see that the government's ability to spend doesn't resolve around the taxpayer dollar. The whole fiscal paradigm shifts. Or as the journalist put it, quote, once you get it, you never see things quite the same again. Why bother taxing and borrowing? If the federal government really can't just manufacture all the dollars it could possibly desire, then why bother taxing or borrowing at all? Why not eliminate taxes altogether? The people would rejoice. And why borrow a dollar if you don't need to? We could eliminate the national debt if we stopped borrowing. So why not skip to tab altogether and just spend the money to solve all problems? These are important questions that come up often. When someone realizes that currency issuing governments don't need to rely on taxes or borrowing to spend. In 2018, a 13-year-old named Amy from Bristol, England called the host of a popular podcast known as Planet Money with this suggestion. This is a message from Amy. It's just, quote, I had this idea that because they printed money, instead of giving it to the bank and making inflation go up, they could use it just for the public services. And it would be much easier. And it would be, in general, really good because there's lots of problems with, like, there's not enough tax to go around all the schools and hospitals. So I thought maybe this might help. So thank you for listening. Yeah, thanks, bye. Out of the mouths of babes. Out of the mouths of babes. As they say, Amy sees problems that need solving. Underfunded schools and a national health service that desperately needs public investment. She also witnessed the Bank of England cranking up its digital printing press to manufacture 435 billion euros, not pounds, out of thin air. As part of its quantitative easing program following the financial crisis. To Amy, the solution seems obvious. Forget about taxes and just run the printing press for the people. The hosts of the podcast were intrigued, and they reached out to me with the following question. The government can create money, so what's the point of taxes? Why does the government need to take my money in taxes? I told the folks at Planet Money that MMT recognizes at least 4 important reasons for taxation. We've already touched on the first taxes enable governments to provision themselves, without the use of explicit force. If the British government stopped requiring its people to settle their tax obligations using British pounds, it would rather quickly undermine its provisioning powers. Fewer people would need to earn pounds, and the government would have a harder time finding teachers, nurses, and so on who were willing to work and produce things in exchange for its currency. Amy touches on the second important reason for taxation: inflation. If the government did as Amy suggested, merely spending loads of new money without taxing any of it away from people, it would cause an inflation problem. As we'll see in the next chapter, it's not the printing of money, per se, but the spending of money that matters. If the government wants to boost spending on healthcare and education, it may need to remove some spending power from the rest of us to prevent its own more generous outlays from pushing up prices. One way to do this is by coordinating higher government spending with higher taxes so that the rest of us are forced to cut back a little to create room for additional government spending. That can help manage inflationary pressures by balancing the strain on our economy's real productive capacity. More than any other economic school of thought, MMT emphasizes the importance of deciding what tax increases should accompany new spending and which taxes will be most effective at restraining inflationary pressures. Raising taxes when it's not necessary can undermine fiscal stimulus, and raising the wrong kind of taxes can leave a nation invulnerable to accelerating inflation. We'll see why in the next chapter. So, third, their taxes are a powerful way for governments to alter the distribution of wealth and income. Taxes, or tax cuts, like those passed by the Republicans in December 2017, can be structured to widen the gap between the rich and poor, delivering windfall gains to large corporations and the wealthiest people in our societies. Today, there is more income and wealth inequality than almost at any time in U.S. history. About half of all new income goes to the top 1%, and just three families own more wealth than the bottom half of America. Such extreme concentrations of wealth and income create both social and economic problems. For one thing, it's hard to keep the economy strong when most of the income goes to the thinnest slice of people at the top, who save rather than spend other income. Capitalism runs on sales. You need a reasonable distribution of income so that businesses have enough customers to stay profitable, enough to provide enough employment to keep the economy running well. Extreme concentrations of wealth also have a corrosive effect on our political process and our democracy. Just as tax cuts can be used to exacerbate inequalities, governments can exercise their taxing authority to reverse these dangerous trends. Stepping up enforcement, closing loopholes, raising rates, and establishing new forms of taxation all important levers to enable the government to achieve a more sustainable distribution of income and wealth. So MMT sees taxes as an important means to help redress decades of stagnation and raising inequality. Finally, governments can use taxes to encourage or discourage certain behaviors. To improve public health, battle climate change, or deter risky speculations to financial markets, governments might levy a cigarette tax, a carbon tax, or a financial transactions tax. Economists often refer to these as sin taxes because they're used to deter people from engaging in harmful activities. MMT recognizes that in each case, the purpose of sin tax is to discourage undesirable behaviors, smoking, polluting, or excessive speculation, not to raise money for the sovereign currency issuer. Indeed, the more effective the tax at discouraging these behaviors, the less the government will end up collecting, since the tax is only paid if the behavior continues. If a carbon tax succeeds in stamping out all CO2 emissions, it will yield no revenue, but the tax will have served its true purpose. Conversely, taxes can be used to incentivize behaviors. For example, the government might offer tax rebates to encourage people to buy energy efficient appliances or electric vehicles, which has been in the talks before. Kind of the same thing with, giving subsidies to companies that switch to renewable energy, or even electric companies that start using renewable energy to power their stuff too. That's what they're talking about. For all these reasons, taxes are an indispensable policy tool that cannot be abandoned simply because the government can manufacture its own currency. Amy was definitely onto something, though most governments, including hers, routinely spend more than they tax. And they do it year after year without creating an inflation problem. In fact, many of the world's largest economies have been actively trying to get their inflation rates to move higher. So, why not just spend more without worrying about raising taxes? And what's the point of borrowing your own currency if you can manufacture it yourself? We turn to these questions below. So, the rule of borrowing an MMT. Until I switched my own thinking from the household model, tabs, to the currency issuer model, stab, I wasn't able to see clearly what taxes and borrowing were really about. Flipping that mental switch wasn't easy, and I initially resisted Moser sequencing. It didn't feel right, but something about it gnawed at my brain. I was training to become a professional economist, and it seemed more important for me to try and get it right than to cling to the controversial, conventional way of thinking, simply because the textbooks had decided that the taxpayer was at the center of the monetary universe. So, I went in search of answers. I spent months researching the intricacies of government finance. I pored over financial documents from the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury, read countless books and articles about monetary operations, and talked with numerous government insiders. Then I began writing. I organized my thoughts around a single question: do taxes and bonds finance government spending? Everything I had been taught suggested that this was a pointless exercise. Everyone knew. The purpose of taxing and borrowing was to finance government spending. I thought of the Mark Twain quote, I ain't what you don't know. That gets you into trouble. It's what you know, for sure, that just ain't so. And decided to keep an open mind. As I began to write, I honestly had no idea where I would arrive. I was committed to letting the research be my guide. In 1998, I published in an early draft of the paper, and 2 years later, a more polished version became my first peer-reviewed academic publication. The answer to the question I had posed was no. It's not easy to see how it all works. In fact, it's impossible to disentangle the government's monetary operations in discrete time on any given day. There are literally millions of moving parts throughout the year. The Federal Reserve handles trillions of dollars in U.S. Treasury payments. Each month, millions of households and businesses write checks to Uncle Sam, and those payments clear between commercial banks and the Federal Reserve. The Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and primary dealers coordinate about when to auction treasuries, what mix of maturities to offer, and how many total securities to offer at each auction. The whole thing is like a perfectly choreographed water ballet, a perpetual motion machine, clearing tax and payments, federal spending and borrowing in perfect unison. To the naked eye, it can appear that the government is collecting dollars from taxpayers and bonds buyers because it needs those dollars to pay its bills. Viewed this way, the purpose of taxes and bonds is to finance government spending. That's how Thatcher wanted us to see it. Through the lens of a household, MMT looks at what's happening through the lens of the currency issuer. The government doesn't need our money. Just as the reason for taxation is not to provide the government with its own currency, the purpose of auctioning U.S. treasuries, that is, borrowing, isn't to raise dollars for Uncle Sam. Does the government need to borrow? The answer, it doesn't. It chooses to offer people a different kind of government money, one that pays a lot of interest. In other words, U.S. treasuries are just interest bearing dollars. To buy some of those interest bearing dollars from the government, you first need the government's currency. We might call the former yellow dollars and the latter green dollars. When the government spends more than it taxes away from us, we say that the government has run a fiscal deficit. That deficit increases the supply of green dollars. For more than 100 years, the government has chosen to sell U.S. treasuries at an amount equal to its deficit spending. So if the government spends $5 trillion but only taxes $4 trillion away, it will sell $1 trillion of worth of U.S. U.S. treasuries. What we call government borrowing is nothing more than Uncle Sam allowing people to transform green dollars into interest-bearing yellow dollars. MM2 shows why it's a mistake to look at government borrowing through the household lens. If you and I borrow to purchase a home or an automobile, we don't walk into a bank, hand over a stack of cash to the loan officer, and then ask to borrow the money to buy a house or car. The reason we borrow the money is because we don't have it. Unlike a household, the government spends first, supplying the dollars that can be used to buy government bonds. As we've seen in Chapter 3, it does this to support interest rates, not to fund expenditures. So, staying within the limits. Once you internalize the difference between the currency issuer and a currency user, you can begin to see, through a new lens, why so much of our political discourse is broken. Free of the constraints that bound us in a gold standard world, the US now enjoys the flexibility to operate its budget not like a household, but in the true service of its people. That leaves us off, and I'll see you guys next time. Hey guys, welcome back. This is just going to be the continuation of the last video. I do apologize for interruption, so let's go ahead and finish chapter 1 real quick. It says, to get there, we must break free of Thatcher's dictum. That means shedding the myth that the government has no money of its own, that it must ultimately get the money it needs from us, the taxpayer. MMT shows that this is exactly backward. In purely financial terms, our government can afford to purchase whatever is for sale, and in its own currency, it can never, quote, run out of money. As President Obama once claimed. Does that mean that there are no limits? Can we just print our way to prosperity? Absolutely not. MMT is not a free lunch. There are very real limits, and failing to identify and respect those limits could bring great harm. MMT is about distinguishing the real limits from the self-imposed constraints that we have the power to change. It may seem like Congress is already spending without limit. The U.S. projected to run trillion-dollar deficits, and the publicly held debt is on track to rise from $16 trillion in 2019 to $28 trillion by 2029. In many ways, it looks like there's nothing holding Congress back. Technically, there is. Congress has adopted a number of technical procedures and budgetary conventions that are meant to slow or impede new federal spending. Let's just look at a handful of them. First, as noted earlier, is PAYGO, a rule that currently operates in the U.S. House of Representatives. PAYGO is a self-imposed rule that makes it harder for lawmakers to approve new spending. If you want to put more federal dollars into, say, education, you don't just have to win enough votes to fund that priority. You also have to win support for the tax increase or spending cut you're attaching to legislation to pay for it. Adding to the deficit is not an option under PAYGO. The rule is there to force Congress to budget like a household. Another self-imposed constraint, known as the Byrd Rule, exists on the Senate side. Under the Byrd Rule, deficits can increase, but they can't continue to rise beyond the 10-year budget window. Third, both the House and Senate are required to seek a budget score from agencies like the Congressional Budget Office or the Joint Committee on Taxation before lawmakers can even vote on major legislation. A poor score from one of these agencies can literally stop a bill in its tracks. Finally, Congress faces a debt ceiling limit, which places a legal limit on the amount of federal debt the government can incur. Because all these constraints were imposed by Congress, they can all be waived or suspended by Congress. In other words, they are binding only if Congress wants them to bind. Congress can, and frequently does, rewrite the playbook. For example, House Republicans quickly suspended the PAYGO rule to pass their Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. To pass their version of the bill, Senate Republicans had to deal with the Byrd Rule. They did this by assuming wildly optimistic economic growth and scheduling personal income tax cuts to expire after 2025. Together, these maneuvers allowed Republicans to gimmick their way around the Byrd Rule, producing, quote, evidence that the tax cuts wouldn't increase the deficit outside the 10-year budget window. And of course, we have all borne witness to the recurring dramas over the debt ceiling limit. In theory, this limit, first enacted in 1917, is there to do just that. Limit the size of the national debt. In practice, lawmakers have increasingly viewed any approaching debt ceiling limit as a political opportunity to grandstand or extract legislation concessions. But at the end of the day, Congress always musters the will to avert default by raising the debt limit. It has done so some 100 times since the limit was enacted. If Congress frequently unshackles itself, then what's the point of all these non-binding constraints? Why not eliminate PAYGO, the Byrd Rule, the debt limit statute, and other self-imposed checks on government spending? Why not stop pretending that Congress needs to budget like a household? The truth is, lawmakers find the self-imposed constraints politically useful. For one thing, members of Congress routinely face pressures from voters seeking more generous funding for healthcare, education, and so on. The budget rule gives them political cover, and so to explain their philosophical opposed Philosophically opposed to boosting Pell Grant funding to help low-income students attend college, lawmakers can feign empathy with their constituents while claiming their hands are tied because of the deficit. If they couldn't hide behind the deficit myth, what excuse would they just use to justify withholding support? It helps to have a bad cop. Others in Congress look for ways to turn self-imposed constraints into political opportunities. Lemons in the lemonade, so to speak. Instead of fighting to overturn the constraints, they find ways to pair their spending objectives with other policy goals. For example, a progressive Democrat might embrace pay-go by calling for an array of new taxes on the rich to pay for new programs aimed at helping poor and middle-income families. Robin Hood was beloved by the people, after all. Our real limits. Viewed through the lens of MMT, we see that the US government is nothing like a household or a private business. The key difference is simple and inescapable. The government issues the currency, the US dollar, and everyone else, households, private businesses, states and local governments, and foreigners, merely use it. This gives Uncle Sam an incredible advantage over the rest of us. Uncle Sam doesn't need to come up with the dollars before he can spend. The rest of us do. Uncle Sam can't face mounting bills that he can't afford to pay. The rest of us can. Uncle Sam will never go broke. The rest of us could. So we'll not tell Congress to just keep spending until all our problems are solved. Only if that were that easy. Inflation, the subject of our next chapter, is a real danger. To be clear, MMT is not about removing all limits. It's not a free lunch. It's about replacing our current approach, one obsessed with budget outcomes. One that prioritizes human outcomes, while at the same time recognizes and respecting our economy's real resource constraints. In other words, MMT redefines what it means to engage in fiscal responsible budgeting. To paraphrase Democratic political strategist James Carville, who during Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign famously coined the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." MMT points out, quote, "It's the economy's real resources, stupid." We are a nation rich with real resources, advanced technologies, an educated workforce, factories, machines, fertile soil, and an abundance of natural resources. We are blessed to have enough of what matters. We can build an economy that provides a good life for all. We just need to budget our real resources. Thank you guys for joining for Chapter 1. Tomorrow, or sometime this week, I will be filming Chapter 2. And I hope you guys love that as well. Let me know down in the comments what you guys have thought about it so far. Any questions, concerns, or maybe just things maybe you learned from the book that you like to discuss more. Other than that, have a great day.